Burning of the Eyes. The life story of talented architect Rene Jacob is an illustration of a monstrous injustice. Rene was tied and led to a forge. One of the Duke's soldiers heated a metal rod on the coals and lifted it to the unfortunate man's eyes. The cruel nobleman threw a bag of gold at his feet and showed no mercy. The hot rod touched the builder's eyes. The eyeball burst from the heat, and the smoldering mucus slid over his cheeks. The smell of burning flesh filled the air.
Masks of shame. In the Middle Ages, citizens were sentenced to wearing masks of shame for minor incidents, slander, and violation of public order. The most popular was a mask called the bridal gossip. Metal plates tightly ringed the head of the gossiper, depriving her of an opportunity to talk. An iron helmet in the form of a boar's head was invented for gluttons. Wearing it, they were deprived of the opportunity to eat. The chatterers were led through the streets in clownish masks, with horns sticking out of their mouths. Liars tried on long noses, and those who liked to eavesdrop wore large comical ears.
The Sicilian Bull. The Sicilian bull was most likely invented on the island of Sicily in the 6th century BC. It was also called the Bull of Phalarid, named after the ancient Greek tyrant who came up with the idea of this torturous construction. Phalarid's idea was as sophisticated as it was cruel. He wanted to roast a living person placed inside a copper vat as an entertainment for spectators. For this purpose, the structure was given the shape of a horned animal, and a curved tube was placed inside of it. According to legend, Phalarid asked the blacksmith who had made the bull to climb inside to check whether everything was done exactly to specification. And so the blacksmith became its very first victim. However, Phalarid paid for his cruelty later, as he himself was roasted in the bull by his rebellious subjects. The Byzantine merchant Meridius tried to establish a monopoly on salt during a war. When the emperor found out, he sentenced the greedy merchant to a painful death. Almost the whole city gathered to see the execution. 5 guards were needed to force him into the brass beast. When the hatch was shut, one of the executioners lit a fire. Almost immediately, Meridius began to gasp from the heat. As he was choking, he decided that he could grab the copper tube with his lips and suck some air in from outside. As he inhaled, it became a roaring scream, which the pipe turned immediately into a bullish roar. The spectators of the execution looked at the bull with admiration and fear. The brass monster roared inwardly. Smoke came from its nostrils. The executioners threw a bunch of aromatic herbs into the fire so the smell of the roasted meat would not offend anyone.
Strappado and Strappado ladder. Most people have a very low threshold for pain. You don't need special, sophisticated torture devices to interrogate them. Tie the victim's hands behind their back with a strong rope, and then lift them by their wrists or elbows just a few feet above the ground. Sometimes additional weight can be tied to the victim's feet. Most of the work will be done by gravity. The pain in the shoulders from all that weight would make the interrogated person confess to any and all crimes. The simple device used to hoist the body off of the ground is called a strappado. The strappado ladder is a rack introduced by an unknown German executioner in the beginning of the 18th century. The painful pressure of the cross beams on the back as the victim is being stretched over the rack. Breaking on the wheel. The Spanish remember 1483 very well. Torquemada himself was appointed the Grand Inquisitor. He began eradicating heresy, sending thousands of people to die burned at the stake, sometimes without any trial. Carlos Garcia of Aragon was one of the few human rights activists. He defended the people whom the Inquisition considered to be heretics. Once, a letter sent by Carlos to the king saved the lives of 45 people. When Torquemada found out, the Grand Inquisitor began to worry seriously about his position. 2 weeks later, Carlos was charged with desecrating the symbols of faith. Torquemada himself supervised the interrogation. Carlos was stretched on the spokes of a large wooden wheel, firmly tying his limbs to the rim. For several hours his legs and chest were burned with hot irons, forcing him to sign a document on the abdication of the profession of lawyer, but he refused. Then Torquemada ordered to shred Carlos's muscles with hooks. Carlos writhed in pain and shouted insults at his tormentors. Even with torn nails and scorched hair, he demanded a fair trial, remaining a professional until the end. When the inquisitor realized he couldn't crush the lawyer's obstinacy, he ordered to leave him stretched out on the wheel forever.
The gallows. There is hardly a more frightening sight to a criminal than the gallows. For over 2,500 years, the gallows would serve as an execution point for robbers, state traitors, and murderers. Nooses placed around their necks, and then their bodies drop, their feet kick, their necks crack. Surprisingly, this execution has always been considered one of the most humane. In England, a traitor by the name of Guy Fawkes intended to blow up Parliament using a large quantity of gunpowder. His efforts were thwarted, and he was sentenced to hang at the gallows. To this day, in England, they celebrate Guy Fawkes Day, making sure to hang his body in effigy, and children wearing his mask run through the streets asking a penny for the guy.
The rack. Initially, a kind of torture through suspension on a horizontal crossbar was called a rack. A criminal's hands were tied behind his back, and he was raised up by a rope, so gravity served as the primary means of torment. The horizontal rack was introduced by the Constable of the Tower of London, John Exeter, in the middle of the 15th century. The principal operation of this mechanism is based on the torque, which stretches the joints and tears the muscle ligaments. It is enough to turn the lever a little so that the prisoner feels a strong pain in the shoulder joints or lower back. His ribs begin to press on the lungs, suffocating him. When the critical tension is reached, even a slight turn of the lever can break the prisoner's tendon or dislocate the joint. Particularly hardy criminals are put on spiked rollers which tear their back into shreds. The manual guillotine. The man before you is Jules-Henri de Formant. He inherited the title of executioner. For 300 years, regardless of the political regime, his ancestors occupied the position of executioner. His great-great-grandfather cut off ears and chopped off the fingers of rebels who didn't want to obey the will of Louis XVI. His great-grandfather was the first to experience the guillotine during the French Revolution. And his grandfather, who had the nickname Jean Slasher, knew dozens of ways of removing the head from the body. If the convict was a peasant, Jean cut his neck with one of his axes, gently pushing the blade between the vertebrae with a small hammer. For a public and bloody spectacle, a manual guillotine with a wooden knife and a heavy sledgehammer was used. If the convict was of noble blood, the slasher took his head off with one blow of his sharpened sword. Only the most experienced executioners were strong and deft enough for that. The old people said Jules was like his grandfather. He works without mistakes, where others are plagued with nerves and guilt. Torture of the hands.
5 robbers from the Richard Dawson's gang were punished hard. The executioner cut off their hands, but before that they were forced to confess all their crimes. The first robber's fingers were crushed by a jagged vice. He screamed when his bones cracked under the pressure of the iron jaws, and he confessed the robberies and the murders. His brother spoke almost immediately, but the executioner punished him and cut off 2 fingers with a cleaver. The youngest member of the gang's hands were nailed to the table, but he refused to testify against his accomplices. The only woman among the robbers had several wooden chips plunged under her fingernails. She confessed that she robbed more than 100 people by pouring sleeping pills into their drinks. The treasurer of the gang would not confess where the stolen goods were. He began to talk once they poured turpentine on his fingers and cauterized them with a red-hot iron. These mutilated hands were put on public display during the execution of the gang leader. They served as a warning to anyone who is considered stealing what they want.
Chest of body parts.
Only those who were committed with the most serious crimes would get the most extreme executions, such as sawing, dismemberment, and quartering. On a day when many prisoners were to be dismembered, executioners would put the limbs and body parts in chests. These body parts oftentimes were fed to dogs or just left in the chests until the next execution. Weighing the witch. There was a peculiar method of judicial proceedings in the 15th century. Women suspected of witchcraft were weighed on scales. The judges considered that the witch's broom couldn't lift more than 99 pounds into the air. Therefore, if a woman weighed more than 99 pounds, she was innocent. The most reliable way for a woman to remove charges was a certificate of weighing, authenticated by judges of the Dutch city of Oudwater. Emperor Charles V stated that the scales of this city were the most accurate. By the beginning of the 17th century, not only the Dutch, but also accused women from neighboring Germany came to be weighed in Oudwater to prove their innocence.
Torture shoes. Cesare Mancini worked in a shoe shop by day, and by night he robbed people. He normally chose newcomers as victims, but once he mistakenly attacked a local grocer. The grocer recognized Mancini and informed the authorities about him. 7 years later, the shoemaker saw the grocer among newly arrived prisoners. Mancini decided that fate gives him a chance to take revenge. During a knife fight, the grocer was killed, but before he died, he managed to disfigure the shoemaker's face and cut the tendon on his right arm. Given his good behavior in the past, the jailers offered Mancini a choice: the death penalty for the murder of a cellmate, or lifelong work as a prison executioner. Not wanting to die, Mancini put on the mask. Now his shoes were used to inflict pain and injury. Among his best inventions was an iron boot for deforming the feet, shoes with hot coals for baking the soles of the feet. Mancini's masterpiece of cruelty was the Spanish boot. He put an iron plate on his victim's leg, and then took a pointed wedge and a small sledgehammer. The first drop fell on the ankle. The man didn't have time to rest from the pain as the wedge crushed the front part of the shin in 2 other places. "Is it too tight?" the shoemaker asked helpfully, and hearing a cry of pain in response, lightly twisted the cartilage under the kneecap. A few years later, he was called the Bloody Shoemaker. Prisoners prayed to God that they did not have to try on Mancini's shoes. Imprisonment in a cage. Parents remember Catherine as a cheerful beauty with rosy cheeks and a beautiful posture. In August 1609, she became a maid to the Countess Bathory. 3 months later, Catherine disappeared, and a year later, Lady Bathory was accused of massacres. During the trial, the remains of several dozen girls, tortured by the Blood Countess, were found near the castle, but the body of Catherine wasn't found until 15 years later. She was caged in a secret chamber of the castle. The cage hung from the ceiling, 2 meters above the floor. The first days of imprisonment, the prisoner would not give any signs of despondency and hoped that the Countess would set her free. A week later, she was very skinny. Her face had turned gray, and a desperate shine appeared in her eyes. Catherine's legs would have swollen because of the constant tension, and she would have been very ill. Despair would rob her of her sanity. She'd look like a living skeleton, covered with pale skin, with legs deformed from standing. Lady Bathory forgot about her prisoner, as well as many others. At night, the hoarse groan of the girl, dying of exhaustion, would have echoed through the dungeon, but the stone walls completely absorbed all sound. The cradle of Judah is considered one of the most effective and, at the same time, inhumane instruments of interrogation. The hands and feet of the defendant are tied up with ropes. The executioners take the free ends of the ropes in their hands and begin to pull them. Thanks to a system of hanging blocks, this does not require much strength, and the executioners can control the position of the victim's body like a puppeteer manipulating a marionette. At first, the body is lifted to the ceiling. The executioners tighten the ropes in such a way that the victim's pelvis is turned downward, and then they lower the body over a sharp apex of a large pyramid. The apex is digging into the perineum, tearing the tendons, the nerve, and the lymph nodes. The interrogated prisoner's weight forces them to settle upon the stake. Because of the unimaginable pain, they begin to rock from side to side, but it only leads to deepening and widening the wound. Most of the sentenced ones surrender in a few minutes, few hours at the absolute most, but the executioners continue the torture all night.
Flaying.
Mention of this torture is found in the chronicles of ancient Assyrians, the Aztecs, and ancient China. Skinning was applied to criminals, heretics, and even during ritual sacrifices. In 1396, Chinese Emperor Zhu Yangzhang ordered to punish 5,000 women blamed for treason. This torture was sometimes used as part of a public execution in medieval Europe and existed until the beginning of the 18th century. Robert was sentenced to public skinning for an attempt on the life of the king. The execution began at noon, and the executioners were ordered to keep it going until sunset, so as many people as possible could see it. Robert screamed in pain and begged for mercy when the first cuts were made to his skin. In 2 hours, the executioners began to separate the skin from muscles, and Robert fainted. They poured cold water on the criminal and used drugs to keep him awake. The art of the executioners was so great they took off the skin in one whole piece. After sunset, Robert's body, bare muscles and exposed nerves, were hung next to the bloody shell which was his skin.
The pillory. In the Middle Ages, citizens were sentenced to public ridicule for minor offenses, slander, and disturbance of the peace. The guilty were taken to a crowded square, and their hands and neck were put in wooden stocks. They were forced to bend over, and a placard explaining who they were and why they were worthy of condemnation was placed on the pillory. Passers-by threw mud, rotten food, excrement, and sometimes even stones. Punishment for gambling. The Gwynplaine smile.
Fortune did not smile on him. Before turning the case over to court, the card club owners cut a bloody smile on Henry's face as a warning to others. The court decided to put him in shackles and put him on public display. A burning feeling of shame, like a hangover but 10 times stronger, corrodes him from inside. Every expression he made with his face caused excruciating pain to his still healing wounds. The former traitor became a laughingstock for onlookers, and a clear example that gambling can lead to the loss of all your achievements in a short period of time.
The heretic's fork. The pointed teeth of the fork forces him to keep his head tilted back. The punctured skin would develop sores. The philosopher's weak muscles are heavy. His back and neck are cramped with terrible spasm. Vice for hands, knees, and skull.
In the East, they chop off thieves' hands, while Europeans are prone to more thoughtful punishments. The device of the torture grip is simple, a rotating screw and 2 pressing planes. But even here there's room for human imagination. Imagine what a primal horror a man experiences when the bones of his fingers are gradually crushed in the iron jaws of a vice, the bones destroyed in such a way that they could not mend. Likewise, forearm breaks need only larger vices, and the executioner should be more muscular. But most terrifying of all would have to be the vice on the skull.
The anchor.
Otto Schwartz, an artisan from Bremen, was arrested on suspicion of spying. 6 months spent in solitary confinement and constant night interrogations turned him from a healthy young man to a desperate old man. After the Congress of Vienna in 1813, he and other prisoners of the regime of Napoleon were released, but Otto's short temper played a cruel joke on him. He was rude to one of the guards escorting him to the amnesty chamber. To teach Schwartz humility, he was chained to an anchor for a week. And now here he is, sitting on a barrel, with his head bowed to his knees. His ankles and neck are raw from the iron hoops. This is especially humiliating for Otto, who was always so proud of his perfect posture.
The guillotine.
Centuries ago, almost an entire city would have gathered in the squares to watch the guillotine. Beggars and kings alike gathered together to watch the executions. During the French Revolution, nearly 40,000 heads were cut off over the span of just a few years. Isn't it ironic that Dr. Guillotine designed his apparatus to save the criminals from unnecessary suffering? The man lying on the bench before you was destined to become the last publicly decapitated criminal in France. His verdict reads, Eugene Weidmann, age 31, sentenced to death by cutting off his head. Scourging. Anna Joseph de Méricourt devoted her life to the French Revolution. She participated in the capture of the Bastille in 1789 and repeatedly led various protests. In the spring of 1793, the supporters of her enemy seized her and subjected her to public execution. She was surrounded by the women of her enemy's party. She was pushed and then beaten, and when she fought back, she was knocked to the ground. When they realized that they could not break her, they decided to beat her with a whip. They tied her hands and ripped her dress off. Anna's back was very quickly covered by bloody stripes as the women beat her with everything they could find. Her cries of pain drowned in the screams of the raging crowd. When the number of blows exceeded a few dozen, Anna fell unconscious. Only a low moan showed that she was still alive. The skin on her back was torn to ribbons. The beating was stopped by one of the few men watching, the leader of the Jacobins, Marat. Anna Joseph miraculously survived, but the pain drove her insane. She spent her last days in a madhouse. The execution was carried out like this. The criminal was strapped into a chair and electrodes were attached to his body. After reading the verdict, the executioner turned on the current. The body of the criminal shuddered. The fingers dug into the armrests. The eyes rolled up. And if the first charge didn't kill, the procedure was repeated.
The chair of inquiries. The chair of inquiries was actively used for interrogations in medieval Europe. The first version was made of wood, but over time spikes and other details became metallic. The human body tightly pressed against the chair with the help of straps and clamps for the limbs. Spikes would pierce the skin of the back, arms, legs, and buttocks. Due to the incessant pain, the offender begins to fidget. By trying to stand, the prisoner pierces his skin with the thorns deeper and deeper into the skin. Soon the prisoner confesses everything. Breaking on the wheel. The Spanish remember 1483 very well. Torquemada himself was appointed the Grand Inquisitor. He began eradicating heresy, sending thousands of people to die burned at the stake, sometimes without any trial. Carlos was stretched on the spokes of a large wooden wheel, firmly tying his limbs to the rim. For several hours his legs and chest were burned with hot irons, forcing him to sign a document on the abdication of the profession of lawyer, but he refused. Then Torquemada ordered to shred Carlos's muscles with hooks. Carlos writhed in pain and shouted insults at his tormentors. Even with torn nails and scorched hair, he demanded a fair trial, remaining a professional until the end. When the Inquisitor realized he couldn't crush the lawyer's obstinacy, he ordered to leave him stretched out on the wheel forever.
Torture chair from Cuenca. This unusual device was discovered in one of the medieval castles of the city of Cuenca in Spain. For a long time it belonged to Henry Willett, a cultural patron. Henry gave it and other exhibits of his personal collection to the Brighton Museum. This iron chair is a unique kind of work of medieval engineering. Using it, the executioners could conduct an effective interrogation session without using additional tools. Shackles for the legs, handcuffs, hoops for the neck and chest allowed to fasten the victim to the chair firmly. The main block of the chair in its upper part contains a vise for squeezing the skull, needles for piercing the eye, and more clever mechanisms for stretching the tongue and breaking the nose. The hole in the seat opens for the executioner's access to the victim's genitals. Also, since the chair is a metal structure, it can be quickly heated by fire, causing severe burns to the body.
Sexual torture. Obviously, a person experiences the greatest torment when his basic instincts are limited. One sadist's fantasies mastered this area and went even further. The belt of fidelity on the hips of a young woman not only prevented her from accidentally intimate relationships, but also rubbed her hips and crotch for months, preventing normal hygiene. Anti-masturbation rings caused suffering to young men whenever they were sexually aroused. With the help of wooden products and phalloid shapes, the executioners roughly imitated sexual penetration, causing severe pain to their victims. But the most terrible tool for sexual torture was the mechanical pear. It was injected into natural body cavities of both men and women and was gradually opened with the help of a rotary screw. Segments of the pear tore through soft tissue. Neck traps. A neck trap is a device designed to safely hold and move particularly dangerous criminals. A classic trap is a ring on a long stick, like an oven fork for hot pots. If the jailer was clever enough, he could easily indicate the direction of movement to the offender with a simple gesture. If the offender resisted, he was pressed against the wall, squeezing his Adam's apple and twisting his neck until he began to choke. For violent criminals, there was an improved collar, with spikes and a chain on the buckle. Any abrupt movement led to rupture of the arteries or damage to the windpipe. As a rule, traps without a long handle were tools of humiliation. A long time spent in such a collar turned a criminal into a tamed beast.
Nailing the tongue. No one could call Francois Baude a chatty man. He did not like gossip and very rarely discussed politics or faith. One day he was very unlucky. He was walking along a market in a good mood and told a fish dealer a political joke. To his dismay, the merchant did not laugh, and Francois was seized by the guards. He was accused of insulting a noble person, and because of his sincere repentance, he was given a moderate sentence. Francois was numb with fear. The executioner had to grab his hair, lean his chin against the pillar. A quick drop of the hammer and a large forged nail punched through the flesh and entered the pillar. Francois moans with pain and stomps his feet feebly. He stood there for 6 hours. Francois would moan in pain and stomp his feet. He stood there for 6 hours.
Impalement. The prince of the Valache called his treasurer into his chambers. He told his treasurer that there had been a considerable amount of money missing from the treasury. The treasurer announced that it was his wife, Camilla, who had stolen the money, and he required the harshest punishment for her. The woman was sentenced to death by impalement. The executioner began to lubricate the sharpened stick with fat, and one of the jailers stepped on Camilla's neck to keep her from moving around. She saw a decaying skeleton on one of the poles and realized that the same fate awaited for her.
The Nuremberg Maiden. The classical design of the Iron Maiden is a 7-foot-tall sarcophagus with long iron thorns inserted into its inner walls. When a criminal entered into the walls of the sarcophagus, the doors were closed upon him. The thorns would pierce his bodies in various places. The thorns were arranged not to cause fatal injuries. They stuck into the arms, legs, stomachs, eyes, shoulders, and buttocks. So, standing in the suffocating darkness, the man was pierced over and over again until finally bleeding to death. To add insult to injury, the inquisitors opened and closed the sharp doors several times, changing the position of the victim's body. The tool is named the Nuremberg Maiden because the most famous specimen was created in the city of Nuremberg, Germany.
Stork, prayer cross, scavenger's daughter. These tools were used to break the spirit of unruly prisoners. Being in a restrained position or unnatural pose greatly undermines the health of a person, causing intense pain throughout the body. While these devices may come in different forms, the principle was very much the same. The iron staples of the stork fettered the neck and limbs of a man. The cervical spine, the tendons of the legs and hands, and the fibers of most muscles came to extreme strain, increasing with every second. The body gradually weakened. The victim would vomit, fret as if in a fever, and quickly lose strength. The man clad in the scavenger's daughter
was experiencing additional strain in his limbs as he had to kneel on the ground, bending at his elbows. The prayer cross was very much the same, only the limbs and the neck were chained. The chain's length limited by the arms of a metal cross. The victim lay on the cold ground in a crucified pose, and any movement elicited a response of mocking rings from the rusty chains. Torture with water. Bathing of a witch. In the Middle Ages, the cunning inquisitors invented paradoxical laws that made people confess to acts that they never committed. An example of such cunning was bathing a witch. If there was a pond nearby, it would be used. If not, a large wooden barrel would be filled with water. The would-be witch would be hung upside down and dipped into the water. Once their head was under the water, the inquisitor would state, "If they choke and drown, they are innocent. But if they survive, they have had the aid of evil forces." Torturing by rats. Innkeeper Sergio Grasso was convicted of helping revolutionaries of the Netherlands Republic. Sergio was tied to a torture table. A metal cage without a bottom was put on his stomach. The innkeeper's eyes ran around. His worst nightmares began to come true. The investigator took a few small, shabby rats from a small box and put them one by one inside the cage on his chest. The animals began to scratch the human skin with claws. Within a minute, Sergio Grasso screamed with fear and dictated the names. When the list of criminals' names came to an end, the investigator put hot coals on top of the cage. The innkeeper begged for mercy as he confessed everything. He did not know that the death sentence had already been passed to him long ago. Sergio's cry turned into a horrible howl when the rodents, trying to escape the heat, began to make bloody holes in his stomach. The rats bite into his entrails, trying to find a way out. Sergio choked with disgust and writhed in unbearable pain. Torture with water. The funnel. The victim would tell all the needed information in a confession with the help of this torture, without causing any external bodily harm. The impact on the internal organs could be controlled and prolonged for many hours. The essence of the torture was to pour a lot of water into a person. The victim's nose was closed with a clothespin, and the water was poured into its throat. Depending on the severity of the crime, from 4 to 15 liters of water were poured into a person. Sometimes instead of boiling water, molten iron or sewage was used. Cutting off the tongue. Monk Epiphanius left the monastery after the church reforms of 1656. He criticized the church and the czarist power allowed at the Cathedral of the Clergy in Moscow in 1666. For this he was arrested and exiled to Serbia. After several years spent in exile, it was difficult to recognize him as a monk. However, even in inhumane conditions, he continued to uphold his convictions. Then Epiphanius was sentenced to cutting off the tongue. Executioner Gregory, who carried out the punishment, lived in exile for more than 20 years. The monk was asked whether he is ready to renounce his views, and he answered, no. Epiphanius would live another 12 years, silent and bound, but he never renounced his old rituals. In 1682, he and 3 other like-minded people were burned at the stake. Burning at the stake is one of the worst public spectacles ever used as execution. A victim would be tied to a stake. Around their feet would be dry wood and kindling, and then it was set ablaze as they struggled to be free as the fire licked at their feet and burned their body, their skin scorching, the smell of burnt flesh rising through the air, the crowd watching as they screamed and finally died. Probably the most famous person to be burned at the stake was Joan of Arc. Joan was just 17 years old when she led the French army to victory against the British. But once she was captured, the French abandoned her. The British tried her for heresy and found her guilty. They sentenced her to be burned at the stake. Tied to the stake with the fires raging at her feet, she called out to have a cross brought to her, so that she may pray, and as the fires consumed her body, her screams and cries made the entire crowd silent. On May 16, 1920, Joan of Arc was canonized as a holy martyr.
The pendulum. Down, still unceasingly, still inevitably down. I gasped and struggled at each vibration. I shrunk convulsively at every sweep. My eyes followed its outward or upward whirls with an eagerness of the most unmeaning despair. Edgar Allan Poe described the horror of being under the pendulum in his story, The Pit and the Pendulum. How did the pendulum work? The torture would last longer as the iron blade, which was fixed as high as possible under the ceiling of the room, would sway back and forth, using a special mechanism such as the ones found in old clocks, allowing the pendulum to lower with each swing, rocking from side to side for hours, days even, until finally it reached the bottom, slicing the body below in half. The pendulum itself was a semicircular blade which would rip through the prisoner's clothes, then the skin, then the organs, cutting through muscles and bone. The victims of the pendulum would not die from being cut in half, but rather from the pain, the shock, and the loss of blood. Can you imagine how a person must feel lying beneath the blade, slowly coming closer and closer, the fear drawn out and growing, stretched to an eternity? Prisoners often went insane before the blade ever touched their body. Sawing. Edward Black was an ordinary tailor in London. Friends and neighbors knew him as a modest, quiet man. He did not have a family, he led a sober life, and on the weekends he liked to walk in the park. His arrest was a surprise to everyone. Edward was accused of raping several children aged 8 to 12. The trial lasted for only a week because one of the victims was the judge's nephew. The judge was determined to give Black an extremely hard punishment. With the permission of the judges, the relatives of his victims were allowed to come and see Edward in his cage. All of them could look Edward in the eye for the last time and express everything they wanted to say to him. If he had not been put in a cage, the people would have torn his body to shreds with their bare hands. Enraged visitors cursed and spat in his face. But the worst that he heard were the words of one woman. She told him that his execution will help him earn forgiveness. His soul will be clean from sin when his body is sawed into 2 halves. Edward Black was shaken from horror, would dig into his flesh and slowly tear the muscle fibers and bones. He was destined to feel the saw teeth in his body. Before the execution, Edward Black was begging for mercy, but the executioner who was entrusted to see him sawn in half was deaf to his pleas, for the executioner had children of his own.
The Spanish Horse. All her life, Matilda Mendez diligently visited the church and confessed regularly. She worked as a washerwoman for a rich merchant to feed her 2 daughters. One day, early in the morning, guards stormed the doors of her house and dragged Matilda to prison. She was accused of practicing black magic and having a secret connection with the devil. The woman was beaten with a whip and held without food for a week, but she did not confess. So the inquisitors decided to interrogate Matilda on the Spanish horse. It took 3 strong men to put her on the corner of the bar. In the first minutes she squirmed and fell to the floor, but the investigators tied her hands and feet, and a few minutes later a terrible pain pierced Matilda's crotch, and she moaned. To ease the torment, she began to swing on the bar, but the wound caused by the sharp edge only widened. 2 hours later, weights were tied to the woman's feet, and she felt the wooden knife slowly cutting her in half. Being already on the verge of insanity, she confessed that she had added a love potion to the merchant's food, wishing to seduce him. The very next morning, her head was cut off.
Scalding of the feet.
When Mary was caught outside of the house of Count Spencer, she admitted that she was hired to kidnap Count Spencer's son. The Count was outraged and wanted to beat the woman to death, but his wife persuaded him to bring the woman to justice. The trial was overseen by a young judge who had a strange sense of humor. "Why did you decide to kidnap a child?" he asked Mary. "They promised to pay me well. I could not buy firewood, and my legs are very cold," the woman answered. The judge thought for a moment, and then said, "The court has decided to warm your feet." Mary was tied to a wooden bench, and her ankles were shackled into pads. The water in the cast-iron vat was boiling. The executioner picked up a long ladle and showed it to Mary. Her eyes were wildly running around. She did not understand what they were going to do to her. When the first jet of boiling water touched her foot, Mary screamed. Pain and anguish were in her cries. The executioner scooped up water and poured it alternately onto the unfortunate woman's feet. The skin on Mary's legs flushed, and then blisters began to burst. Mary didn't give out a scream anymore. She was only wheezing helplessly, hanging her head against the wooden bed until she lost consciousness. Torture of the feet was widely used in Asia to punish debtors, thieves, and guilty soldiers. In the 21st century, several cases of torture by scalding the feet with boiling oil were recorded.
Violin of gossips. Double violin of gossips. Flute of shame. Old Francesca served as a nurse in a noble house, and she perfectly managed the Count's 3 children. But when rumors about the personal life of her employers began circulating, it was established that their source was Francesca. The Earl ordered the punishment of the elderly gossip. Francesca was taken to the nearest police station and was put in a gossip violin for the whole day. Francesca would look at her hands, unable to turn away. This position should inspire a woman to think of repentance. Very soon, aching pain appears in her back, neck, and elbow joints. Her fingers and hands go numb because of the restricted blood flow. It begins to seem that her hands don't belong to her. Francesca is frightened that she will be disabled for the rest of her life. She forgot about hunger and thirst, and by the end of the punishment she begins to pray for forgiveness. A double violin of gossips can find 2 women who are quarreling with each other. They have to sit face to face and continue to argue. But soon reconciliation was achieved. After a long stay in the violin, cantankerous ladies can get tired of one another. The flute of shame was intended for bad musicians who insulted the noble's hearing with bad music. The device was a rough copy of a real wind instrument, but instead of air valves, it had finger clamps. Together with the iron collar, the clamps forced the person to take the pose of a flutist, which gave the torture a certain comic shade. However, the victims of the instrument were not amused at all. The weight of the full stomach would squeeze his lungs and heart. The sensation of lack of air and heaviness in the chest were complemented with pain from the stretched stomach. If this was not enough, the executioners put a board on the criminal's stomach and then pressed on it or beat it to amplify the suffering. The victim could survive if they vomited the accumulated liquid out, but the survivors often died from deformation of the internal organs. The barrel and medal for drunkenness. The Tsar's mouthpiece, Dmitry Kizilyov, was known to all innkeepers of the city. His visits to drinking establishments often cleaned innkeepers out of all their alcohol. Having gotten away with it for years, he was finally sentenced to public humiliation. The police chief ordered him to be put in a barrel for 1 day. Dmitry sobered up in the cold water quickly. He was naked, and the barrel was in the middle of a crowded square, so the fear of pure humiliation kept him inside the barrel. However, he did not escape mockery. People passed by, pointing and laughing. Some boys threw a rotten vegetable in his face. A few hours later, the drunkard's skin wrinkled because of the cold water. His lips and fingers turned blue from the temperature. Kizilyov promised never to touch another drop of alcohol. In 1714, the Russian Tsar Peter the Great decided to hang a medal for drunkenness from the necks of drunkards and rowdy men. It was made of cast iron and weighed 17 pounds. Depending on the severity of the offense, a person would have to wear the medal for a few days or a few weeks. Such a medal became a real torture for alcoholics. In addition to public disgrace, there was the inability to get any drinks from any bar. Shackles with weights. The heavier shackles with stone block or iron weight were invented for especially dangerous criminals and convicts. The weight was attached to the legs or hands of the prisoner with the help of a strong clamp and chain. After that, every movement of the prisoner became torture. Because of the repetitive strain, the muscles experienced chronic fatigue and the bones deformed. The British Museum stores Assyrian bronze shackles dating back to 10th century BC.
When Catherine's decayed skeleton was found, her father only recognized his daughter by a thin bracelet that he had given her. From the blood countess's diaries, it turned out that Catherine deserved her sad fate only by the fact that for a brief moment she attracted the coveted look of Bathory's lover, the famous artist Caravaggio.
How's it feel to torture somebody?
I don't know.